I woke up to the sound of engines roaring outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was ranch equipment. Then I heard wood cracking. By the time I pulled on my boots and ran outside, two bulldozers were tearing straight through my southern fence line like it didn't exist. Dust rolled across the pasture while construction crews hammered bright orange property stakes deep into my land. My land. A black luxury SUV sat near the gate, untouched by the dirt. Standing beside it in a cream-colored blazer was Vivian Crow, flanked by surveyors and two attorneys carrying thick folders. She looked perfectly calm. One of the lawyers handed me legal notices filled with fines, zoning violations, and revised property maps claiming nearly 400 acres of my ranch belonged to Silver Creek Estates. Then Vivian looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your grandfather knew this transfer was coming." I almost laughed from disbelief. Walter Bennett hated developers more than droughts. That ranch carried my childhood memories in every acre. I learned to ride horses there, learned to mend fences there, learned from my grandfather that land wasn't something you sold, it was something you protected. And that was the moment I realized somebody had been planning this long before my grandfather died. I hadn't planned on coming back to Blackwater County for good. A few years earlier, I'd left town after my construction business collapsed and my marriage went down with it. By the time the divorce papers were signed, I was sleeping in cheap apartments in Phoenix, working overtime just to stay ahead of bills that never stopped coming. Then my grandfather died. Walter Bennett wasn't just my last living relative. He was the kind of man people in this county respected without question. Quiet, tough, stubborn as old oak wood. For over 40 years, developers tried buying pieces of his ranch, and every single time he told them the same thing. No. Coming home after the funeral felt strange at first, like stepping back into a life I'd abandoned. But the ranch still felt alive. 900 acres of rolling fields stretched beyond the house. The old red barn still leaned slightly west from decades of desert wind. A narrow creek cut through the northern pasture exactly where I remembered catching fish as a kid. Every corner of that land carried memories of my family. At first, I thought maybe inheriting the ranch was a second chance, but Silver Creek Estates had grown a lot since I left town. Expensive houses now sat close enough to overlook parts of the property. HOA complaints started showing up within days, mostly about cattle smells and declining neighborhood aesthetics. Sometimes I'd spot drones hovering over the ranch at sunset before disappearing toward the subdivision. I tried ignoring it. I told myself people like Vivian Crow preferred lawsuits over conversation. But after seeing bulldozers on my land that morning, I realized peace was never part of her plan. Vivian Crow didn't waste time pretending this was a misunderstanding. She treated it like an eviction. I stood near the torn fence line while dust drifted across the pasture behind me. Workers kept hammering orange stakes into the ground like they'd already won. A few of my cattle gathered near the creek, restless from all the noise. Vivian barely looked at them. Her attention stayed locked on me. One of the attorneys stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to stop a bullet. He unfolded several oversized survey maps across the hood of the black SUV while the surveyors nodded like obedient assistants. "Mr. Bennett," the attorney said, adjusting his glasses, "after a recent county reassessment, it was discovered that portions of your ranch were improperly recorded decades ago." I stared at the maps. They showed bright red lines cutting directly through my grandfather's property. According to their paperwork, almost 400 acres now belong to Silver Creek Estates. The southern grazing fields, the creek access, even one of the old barns. Vivian spoke calmly, like she was explaining weather forecasts. "The county corrected historical boundary discrepancies last month." "Discrepancies?" I said. "My family's owned this ranch for almost 80 years. She gave a small shrug. "Apparently not all of it." One of the workers nearby laughed under his breath. That irritated me more than I expected. I stepped closer to the maps and immediately noticed something wrong. The paper itself looked brand new, not copied, not archived, new. The ink was too sharp, the folds too clean. Even the county seals looked freshly printed. Then I noticed the signatures. One document claimed to include approval from a county surveyor who, unless I was losing my mind, had died almost 15 years earlier. I looked at the date again. The document had supposedly been filed only 8 years ago. That made no sense. Another page referenced Silver Creek Estates by its current name, even though the subdivision had been called Silver Creek Development during its early construction phase. Tiny details, but enough to make my stomach tighten. "You expecting me to believe this?" I asked. Vivian's expression never changed. "I expect you to cooperate." One of the attorneys handed me another stack of papers. Violation notices. According to the HOA, my ranch operations were now causing multiple infractions against neighboring residential properties. Excessive livestock odor, unauthorized agricultural runoff, unsafe fencing conditions, visual property depreciation. I actually laughed once I read that last one. "You're fining me because cows exist?" The attorney ignored the comment. "Failure to comply may result in escalating penalties beginning immediately." I flipped through the pages. $5,000 per day. My chest tightened. That wasn't pressure. That was financial warfare. Vivian watched my reaction carefully. I could tell she enjoyed seeing people cornered. "You can avoid all this, Mr. Bennett," she said smoothly. "The HOA is willing to negotiate a peaceful transition if you acknowledge the revised boundaries." Then she slid a single-page acknowledgement form toward me. That was the moment I realized what this really was. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted my signature. Because once I signed that paper, even accidentally, they could claim I accepted the revised property lines. I handed it back immediately. "No." For the first time, Vivian's smile faded slightly. "You should think carefully before making this difficult." I looked past her toward the crews digging deeper into my pasture. "This land belongs to my family." "One family doesn't stop progress forever." That sentence hit harder than she probably intended, because suddenly I remembered standing beside my grandfather years earlier near the western ridge while bulldozers worked on the very first Silver Creek roads miles away. I must have been 12. Walter had leaned against the fence watching the construction for a long time before finally saying, "People stop acting human when land values go up." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. Vivian wasn't looking at my ranch like a home. She was looking at it like inventory. I glanced again at the paperwork. The more I studied it, the worse it looked. Some parcel numbers didn't match county formatting. Certain legal descriptions used language too modern for documents supposedly tied to old surveys. One signature looked copied digitally instead of written by hand. But Vivian carried herself with absolute confidence, which meant one of two things. Either she genuinely believed nobody would challenge her, or she already knew people inside the system would protect her. "You really brought bulldozers before proving any of this in court?" I asked. "The revised survey was approved through proper county channels." "That's not what I asked." One of the surveyors avoided eye contact. Interesting. Vivian stepped closer to me then, lowering her voice just enough so the workers couldn't hear. "I know men like you, Cole." I hated how casually she used my first name. "You inherit property, get emotionally attached, and mistake sentiment for ownership." I stared at her. "And I know people like you." That finally made her eyes narrow slightly. "People who build expensive houses next to ranches, then act shocked when cows smell like cows." One of the workers nearby snorted, trying not to laugh. Vivian ignored him completely. Instead, she looked toward the torn fencing and sighed dramatically. "This doesn't have to become ugly." "It already is." Another attorney stepped forward holding a clipboard. "Mr. Bennett, refusal to acknowledge the revised boundaries may result in litigation and immediate enforcement action." "Then sue me." The sentence came out before I fully thought it through, but once I said it, I meant it. Vivian studied me for several quiet seconds. Then slowly, she smiled again, not warmly, predatory. "You really don't understand how much power this HOA has." The confidence in her voice unsettled me more than the threat itself, because powerful people usually bluff loudly. Vivian didn't need to. She sounded like someone who already knew the outcome. Behind us, another fence post snapped under a bulldozer blade. I looked across the ranch toward the old barn near the creek, the same barn my grandfather built himself almost 50 years ago. And for the first time since inheriting the property, I felt something dangerous settle into my gut. This wasn't some petty HOA dispute about fences or livestock complaints. This was organized, planned, and judging by the confidence in Vivian Crow's eyes, they'd probably been preparing for this fight long before my grandfather died. Over the next 2 weeks, Silver Creek Estates stopped pretending this was about paperwork. They started treating me like an enemy they wanted gone. The complaints came first. Every morning, I'd find new notices taped to my front door or stuffed into the ranch mailbox. Noise violations for running equipment before sunrise. Animal control warnings claiming my cattle were aggressive toward neighboring residents. Water usage accusations saying I was illegally diverting creek access from HOA property. It would have been ridiculous if it wasn't happening so fast. 3 notices the first day, 5 the next, then more. I tried responding calmly at first. I called county offices, filed explanations, sent photographs proving most of the accusations were nonsense. Didn't matter. Every time one complaint disappeared, 2 more replaced it. And somehow Vivian Crow always looked completely relaxed through all of it, like she was watching a process unfold exactly the way she expected. One afternoon, I drove into town for feed supplies and noticed people staring at me inside Miller's grocery. Not casually, deliberately. Conversation stopped when I walked past. An older woman near the register actually pulled her grandson closer when she saw me. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Then I found out why. Someone had started posting online about me. Anonymous local community accounts suddenly described me as unstable, aggressive, and dangerous to nearby families. There were posts claiming I threatened HOA workers with firearms. Others accused me of neglecting livestock and contaminating local water sources. None of it was true, but online lies spread faster than truth ever could, especially in a small county where people loved gossip more than facts. I sat in my truck outside the grocery store scrolling through comments while anger crawled slowly up my spine. Typical ranch trash. He should have sold years ago. HOA is trying to protect property values. One comment caught my attention immediately. Walter Bennett refused to cooperate too. That word bothered me, because it suggested this fight didn't start with me. I drove back to the ranch feeling watched the entire way, and honestly, maybe I was. The drones got worse after that. Sometimes I'd hear them hovering over the property late in the evening near the barns. Small black shapes circling above the fields before disappearing toward Silver Creek Estates. The first time I tried following one in my truck, it vanished before I reached the subdivision entrance. The second time, I spotted someone standing near the HOA gate watching me from a distance. Couldn't tell who it was, but somehow that felt intentional too. Then the contractors started backing away. A local fencing company canceled repairs 3 days before scheduled work. Said they were too busy. The equipment mechanic I'd known since high school suddenly stopped answering calls. Even feed deliveries became inconsistent. One shipment arrived 4 days late with no explanation. Another never showed at all. When I finally called the supplier directly, the manager sounded nervous. "Look, Cole, there's pressure right now." "What kind of pressure?" Long silence. Then, "People are saying your property's tied up in legal disputes. Nobody wants to get involved." Nobody wants to get involved. That sentence stayed with me all night, because it confirmed what I'd already started suspecting. Vivian Crow wasn't just using HOA complaints. She was isolating me, and it was working. 3 nights later, things escalated. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of distant metal clanging somewhere outside. At first, I thought wind knocked something loose near the equipment shed. Then I heard cattle moving, fast. I grabbed a flashlight and rifle from beside the bed and drove toward the southern pasture in my grandfather's old truck. The moment my headlight swept across the fence line, my stomach dropped. Someone had cut the wire fencing completely open. Dozens of cattle were pushing through the gap toward the highway beyond the ridge. For the next hour, I worked alone in near darkness, trying to turn them back before someone got killed. One frightened steer actually made it onto the road before I managed to block traffic with the truck. By the time I secured the fence temporarily, sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cold desert wind. I stood there breathing hard while flashlight beams bounced across the damaged fencing. The cuts were clean, deliberate, not weather damage, not an accident. Someone did it intentionally, and they knew exactly where to hit. The next morning, I reported everything to the sheriff's department. Sheriff Dalton arrived around noon, looking irritated before he even stepped out of his vehicle. He listened while I explained the cut fencing, the harassment, the HOA pressure, the drones. Then he sighed heavily. "You got any proof Silver Creek's involved?" "No," I admitted, "but this started right after Vivian came after the ranch." Dalton rubbed the side of his jaw. "Could have been kids. Kids don't cut fencing with bolt cutters." He glanced toward the subdivision in the distance, then away again. That bothered me immediately. "You know something?" I asked. "No," but he answered too quickly. I watched him carefully. Sheriff Dalton had known my grandfather for years. Walter helped his family during drought seasons when their own cattle operation nearly collapsed. Normally, Dalton would have taken this seriously. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, like a man trying very hard not to stand too close to a problem. Before leaving, he gave me the kind of warning people disguise as advice. "You might want to settle this thing quietly, Cole." That hit harder than I expected. Not because of the words, because of the fear behind them. Even the sheriff didn't want conflict with Vivian Crow. Meanwhile, Vivian herself remained perfectly composed through all of it. Every time I saw her publicly, she acted polite, controlled, untouchable. At the gas station one morning, she smiled at me like we were neighbors discussing weather. "No more fence trouble, I hope?" The fact she already knew about it made my skin crawl. I stared at her for a second too long before answering. "You enjoying this?" She tilted her head slightly. "I think resisting inevitable change creates unnecessary stress." Then she walked away carrying expensive coffee like she hadn't spent weeks dismantling my life piece by piece. That night, I finally decided to search through my grandfather's office properly, not casually, systematically. Walter kept decades of ranch records inside an old cedar-paneled room near the back of the house. As a kid, I was never allowed inside without permission. He treated paperwork almost as seriously as livestock. The moment I stepped into the office, something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't explain why. Then I noticed the filing cabinets. Several drawers sat slightly uneven, like they'd been forced shut too quickly. One cabinet locked near the wall had scratch marks around it. I crouched beside it. The metal had definitely been pried open recently. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I started checking files, property taxes, water rights, livestock registrations. Most records remained untouched. But when I reached the older property documents section, entire folders were missing. Not misplaced, removed. Specific years were gone completely. Land surveys, boundary records, original easement agreements, all missing. I stood there in silence, staring at the empty spaces inside the cabinet while my grandfather's old desk lamp cast shadows across the room. Then another realization hit me. Those files disappeared before I inherited the ranch, which meant somebody had entered this office shortly after Walter died, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. The next morning, I stopped thinking about the ranch like a home and started treating it like a crime scene. If somebody broke into my grandfather's office before I inherited the property, then whatever they took mattered enough to hide. I spent the entire day digging through storage rooms, old filing boxes, and dusty cabinets Walter Bennett hadn't touched in years. The ranch house had become a maze of old receipts, livestock records, faded photographs, and handwritten notes stacked inside weathered cardboard boxes. Most people probably would have seen junk, but my grandfather documented everything. And the deeper I searched, the more I realized Walter had been preparing for a fight long before Vivian Crow ever appeared on my property. Near the back of the barn loft, I found an old metal lockbox buried beneath horse blankets and broken lantern parts. The lock had rusted almost completely through, so I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were dozens of letters, county correspondence, legal notices, survey copies, some dated back over 25 years. I sat cross-legged in the dust, reading every page while sunlight cut through gaps in the barn walls, and slowly the picture started becoming clear. Developers had been trying to buy the Bennett Ranch for decades. The first offers were polite. Investment groups offering generous expansion opportunities, luxury resort proposals, retirement community pitches. Then the letters changed tone over time. The offers became more aggressive. Some even warned Walter that refusing development could eventually result in future zoning complications. One letter from nearly 18 years earlier caught my attention immediately. It referenced a dispute over access easements near the southern ridge, the exact same area Vivian now claimed belonged to Silver Creek Estates. Another document mentioned concerns about irregular survey adjustments filed through county channels. Irregular survey adjustments. That sounded familiar. I kept reading. Several pages contained handwritten notes from Walter himself scribbled in the margins. Survey doesn't match original markers. County suddenly changed position after meeting with developers. Don't trust Dalton Sr. Dalton Sr. Sheriff Dalton's father. That stopped me cold. Then I found something even worse. A folded legal notice dated nearly 12 years earlier accusing Walter Bennett of obstructing proposed infrastructure access tied to a private development company. The company name had been crossed out in pen, but underneath, barely visible, I could still read it. Silver Creek Development Partners, the original company behind Silver Creek Estates. I leaned back against the barn wall, staring at the papers while dust floated through the sunlight around me. Vivian Crow wasn't creating a new fight. She inherited an old one, and somehow my grandfather had been holding these people off almost entirely by himself. That realization hit me harder than I expected, because growing up, Walter never talked about pressure, never complained, never let anyone see weakness. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, developers and county officials had apparently spent decades trying to carve apart his land piece by piece, and he fought all of them alone. By late afternoon, I drove into town looking for answers from somebody who actually remembered those older disputes. That led me to Raymond Pike. Ray Pike was nearly 80 now and lived alone on a small cattle property west of town. He and Walter Bennett had been friends since they were teenagers. When I pulled into his gravel driveway, he already seemed to know why I was there. Vivian Crow finally came after the ranch, huh? I nodded. Ray sighed slowly like a man watching history repeat itself. We sat on his porch while evening wind rolled across the fields. I showed him some of the documents I'd found. The moment he saw the old survey disputes, his expression darkened. I told your grandfather years ago this thing would come back around. What thing? Ray stared out toward the horizon for several seconds before answering. Developers been trying to get that land since the 90s. Your ranch sits right in the middle of where expansion companies wanted luxury property access. So they just kept pushing? They kept failing. That answer almost sounded personal. Ray took another slow sip of coffee before continuing. Walter Bennett embarrassed a lot of powerful people over the years. How? He refused to sell. I couldn't help laughing slightly. That's it? Ray looked directly at me. You don't understand how much money sits underneath open land nowadays, Cole. His voice dropped lower. People stop caring about history once they smell profit. Almost the exact same words my grandfather once told me. Suddenly I understood where Walter learned them. Ray pointed toward the documents in my lap. Those survey fights started years before Silver Creek Estates existed. Every time developers got denied, another company appeared under a different name. Then he leaned closer. Your grandfather fought these people for decades. The sentence settled heavily in my chest, because until that moment, part of me still wanted to believe Vivian Crow was just another controlling HOA president abusing power. But this was bigger than HOA rules, much bigger. Silver Creek Estates wasn't the cause of the conflict. It was simply the newest version of a land grab that started years ago. And somehow Walter Bennett held the line almost entirely alone while everyone around him slowly gave up or got bought out. Driving back to the ranch that night felt different. The property no longer looked peaceful. It looked hunted. Every fence line, every pasture, every section of creek, all of it suddenly felt like territory people had been circling for decades waiting to claim. When I got back to the house, I continued searching through Walter's office with a completely different mindset. Not looking for memories anymore, looking for evidence. That's when I found the map. Hidden behind the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet was a rolled-up county survey sealed inside plastic covering. The paper itself looked old enough to crumble at the edges. I carefully spread it across the desk. At first glance, it looked identical to the revised maps Vivian showed me. Then I noticed the markings. Certain boundary lines had been redrawn manually. Different ink colors, different handwriting. And near the southern ridge, somebody had physically altered acreage measurements by hand years earlier. Not recently, years ago. I stared at the map while my pulse slowly started pounding harder, because suddenly one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. What if Vivian Crow wasn't creating fake records now? What if somebody inside the county had been quietly changing property records for years? 3 days after I found the altered survey map in my grandfather's office, Vivian Crow stopped playing defense. She went straight for my throat. I was repairing fencing near the north pasture when a county truck rolled onto the ranch, followed by 2 black SUVs carrying attorneys from Silver Creek Estates. One of them handed me a thick envelope before I could even ask questions. Emergency legal action. According to the filing, I was now officially trespassing on land the HOA claimed belonged to Silver Creek Estates, my own ranch. The complaint also accused me of environmental violations tied to livestock runoff near the creek. Until the dispute was resolved, the county approved temporary operational restrictions affecting grazing access across several sections of the property. I read the paperwork twice because it sounded insane. Then I noticed the signatures. County approval came unusually fast, too fast. Vivian stepped out of the SUV wearing sunglasses and carrying herself like this was already finished. "You should have accepted the settlement when I offered it peacefully," she said. I folded the paperwork slowly. "You filed trespassing claims against the owner of the land? The court will determine ownership." That sentence stayed in my head the rest of the day, because she sounded absolutely certain the court would side with her. Within 48 hours, things got worse. Temporary barricades appeared near the southern access road leading toward the highway. Construction crews claimed they were evaluating infrastructure routes, but everyone knew the real goal: cut off my ranch access. Without that road, cattle transport became nearly impossible. Feed deliveries slowed again. Fuel shipments became delayed. Equipment repair companies suddenly stopped returning calls entirely. Then my tractor broke down. Not naturally. Somebody had poured dirt into the fuel tank. I sat there staring at the ruined engine while heat rolled across the ranch in heavy desert waves. Repair costs alone nearly emptied what savings I had left, and the bills kept stacking higher. Legal consultation fees, emergency survey requests, livestock transportation adjustments, temporary fencing repairs. Every single day felt designed to bleed me financially until I finally surrendered. At night, I'd sit alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid invoices, while my grandfather's old clock ticked against the wall. For the first time since returning home, I started asking myself a dangerous question. What if Vivian Crow already won before this even started? A week later, I got part of that answer. I drove into town early one morning and spotted Vivian entering the county administration building with 3 men in expensive suits I'd never seen before. One carried development blueprints under his arm. Developers, not HOA board members. Developers. I parked across the street and watched through the windshield while they disappeared inside. 2 hours later, they walked out smiling. One of the men shook Vivian's hand like they just finalized something important. That's when I understood the real scale of this. Silver Creek Estates wasn't fighting over property lines anymore. They were preparing expansion plans, and my ranch sat directly in the middle of whatever project they wanted approved. That evening, Vivian called me personally for the first time. Her voice sounded almost friendly. "I think we should stop wasting time fighting each other." I nearly laughed hearing that after weeks of harassment. "What do you want?" "A resolution." Funny way of showing it. She ignored the comment. "The HOA is prepared to offer you a private settlement." I stayed quiet. Then she finally said it. "Sell quietly and walk away." The calmness in her voice unsettled me more than yelling would have, like she genuinely believed every person eventually breaks under enough pressure. "How much?" "A generous amount." "That ranch isn't for sale." Long silence, then her voice hardened slightly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said quietly. You are. I hung up before she could answer. That decision cost me almost immediately. The intimidation escalated after that phone call. First came the trespassers. Around midnight one evening, ranch dogs started barking near the equipment sheds. By the time I grabbed a flashlight and got outside, headlights were already disappearing down the dirt road near the western pasture. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints around the barn entrances. 2 locks had been broken clean off. Nothing appeared stolen, which somehow felt worse, because it meant they wanted me knowing somebody had been there. A few nights later, my ranch security cameras suddenly stopped working. All of them. Not damaged, disabled. The wiring near the main control box had been cut professionally. I stood there staring at the severed cables while anger slowly turned into something colder. Fear. Not fear of Vivian herself. Fear of how many people might be involved with her. Then came the fire. I smelled smoke just after sunset while checking water tanks near the eastern ridge. At first I thought lightning hit dry brush somewhere nearby. Then I saw flames, small but bright against the darkening sky. I drove toward them fast and found one of the original Bennett property markers burning beside the fence line. An old wooden boundary post my grandfather installed decades earlier. Someone had soaked it with accelerant. By the time I extinguished the fire, half the marker had collapsed into black ash. I stood there alone in the dark, staring at what remained while smoke drifted into the night air. That post wasn't random. Whoever burned it understood exactly what it represented. History, ownership, legacy. And suddenly the message became painfully clear. They weren't just trying to pressure me legally anymore. They were trying to erase the Bennett family entirely. That realization finally cracked something inside me. Later that night, I sat on the porch outside the ranch house holding one of my grandfather's old whiskey glasses, while exhaustion settled into my bones like concrete. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every day brought new threats, new expenses, new pressure, and Vivian Crow somehow remained untouched through all of it. Connected to county officials, developers, attorneys, maybe even law enforcement. Meanwhile, I was one exhausted rancher bleeding money faster than I could stop it. For the first time since this nightmare started, I honestly considered taking her deal. Sell the land, walk away, start over somewhere else. Because maybe my grandfather fought these people for decades precisely because he knew eventually they'd become too powerful to stop. I looked out across the dark fields where my family had lived for generations and felt something close to defeat creeping into my chest. And the worst part? I think Vivian Crow knew it was happening. The next morning, I finally admitted I couldn't fight this alone. I drove into Blackwater just after sunrise with barely 3 hours of sleep and a folder full of documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Every mile into town felt heavier than the last. Between the legal threats, the vandalism, and the financial bleeding, I was running out of options fast. That's when I remembered Grant Holloway. Most people in the county underestimated Grant because he looked more like a retired history teacher than an attorney. He had silver hair, old cowboy boots, and a habit of carrying legal files inside worn leather saddlebags instead of briefcases. But my grandfather trusted him, and Walter Bennett trusted very few people. Grant's office sat above an old feed supply store near Main Street. No fancy signage, no polished lobby. Just a faded brass plaque that read, Holloway Property and Land Law. When I walked inside, Grant looked up from behind a mountain of paperwork and studied my face for exactly 2 seconds before speaking. Vivian Crow finally made her move? I stopped halfway to the desk. You already know about this? Grant leaned back slowly. Son, half this county knows about it. That wasn't comforting. I handed him the HOA documents, revised surveys, violation notices, and photographs of the altered maps I found at the ranch. Grant didn't say much while reading, but the longer he looked through the paperwork, the more interested he became. That was the first good sign I'd had in weeks. He adjusted his glasses and spread several documents across the desk, side by side. Then he pointed quietly. See this? I leaned closer. One parcel transfer references formatting standards the county didn't start using until 6 years after the document was supposedly filed. I blinked. What? Grant pointed at another page. And this deed transfer number sequence is wrong. How wrong? Impossible wrong. That got my attention fast. Grant's expression hardened as he continued reviewing the files. Legal descriptions don't match historical county templates. Signature spacing changes between pages. Different survey terminology from different decades appears in the same document. He looked up at me finally. These papers are dirty. For the first time since Vivian showed up at my ranch, I felt something shift inside my chest. Hope. Small. Dangerous. But real. Grant kept flipping pages, then suddenly he stopped completely. This right here is the biggest problem. He tapped one of Vivian's revised survey documents. The acreage revision references a deed transfer that doesn't exist in official indexing. I frowned. What does that mean? It means either somebody forgot to file a legally required transfer, Grant looked directly at me, or somebody fabricated one afterward. The room went quiet. I actually felt my pulse speeding up. You think they forged county records? Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully stacked the paperwork together. I think powerful people get very creative when land values reach certain numbers. Almost word for word what my grandfather used to say. That couldn't be coincidence anymore. 2 hours later, Grant and I walked into the Blackwater County Records office together. The moment we requested archived property files tied to the Bennett Ranch, the woman behind the counter became visibly uncomfortable. Not dramatic, subtle, but enough to notice. Her name tag read Linda Marsh. She forced a polite smile while typing into the computer. Those older records may take time to retrieve. Grant rested both hands calmly on the counter. We'll wait. Linda disappeared into the archive room for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, she carried only 2 thin folders. Grant frowned immediately. That's incomplete. These are the available files. No, Grant said calmly. These are the files somebody left available. Linda's face tightened. I noticed her glance briefly toward the back offices, like she was worried someone might overhear us. Grant lowered his voice. We need the original Bennett survey filings from before subdivision approval periods. I'm not authorized to release restricted archive material. Grant smiled slightly. County land archives aren't classified federal intelligence. She hesitated, then finally leaned closer across the counter. You didn't get this from me. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Several older property records disappeared during digital conversion years ago. My stomach tightened instantly. Disappeared? Linda nodded nervously. Archive discrepancies. Grant exchanged a look with me. We both knew what that meant. Someone removed them. Grant requested access to physical archive storage directly. Linda hesitated again before finally unlocking a side records room in the basement level. The place smelled like dust and old paper. Metal shelves stretched wall to wall, packed with decades of county filings. And within 20 minutes, Grant found something huge. Missing archive entries. Not missing files. Entries. Entire filing references had been removed from the county indexing system itself. Grant crouched beside one shelf, comparing handwritten archive logs against digital printouts while I held the flashlight. Jesus, I muttered. Grant looked grim. They didn't just alter records. Somebody tried erasing the existence of the originals. That sentence sent a chill straight through me, because suddenly this wasn't corruption anymore. It was organized historical manipulation. Grant carefully pulled out one weathered storage box labeled Bennett Land Holdings, pre-1989 survey material. Inside sat rolled maps, handwritten easement notes, and original boundary references tied to my family's ranch. Grant spread one of the oldest surveys across the archive table carefully, and that's when everything changed. Near the southern ridge section, the original ranch deed referenced something called protected historical boundary markers. Grant stared at it silently for several seconds before looking up at me. Well, what? They're in trouble. I frowned. What does that mean? Grant pointed toward the survey notes. These markers were grandfathered into state land protections decades ago. I blinked. So? So legally, he looked directly at me. Those boundaries cannot be altered without state-level approval. The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared down at the map while adrenaline slowly surged through my body. Vivian Crow's entire claim depended on revised property lines near the southern ridge, and according to the original deed, those lines were legally protected long before Silver Creek Estates even existed. Grant leaned back slowly, almost impressed. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time in weeks, I stopped feeling hunted, because suddenly I realized something important. Walter Bennett hadn't just been resisting developers all these years. He'd been preparing for war. And for the first time since Vivian Crow stepped onto my ranch, I honestly believed she might lose. Once Grant Holloway found the original boundary protections, everything about Silver Creek Estates started looking rotten. Not suspicious. Rotten. For the next several days, Grant and I dug deeper into county filings, development permits, and HOA financial disclosures. The more paperwork we uncovered, the clearer the real picture became. Silver Creek Estates had never been designed as a quiet residential neighborhood. It was phase one of something much bigger. Luxury expansion plans dating back almost 15 years showed proposals for private golf courses, artificial lakes, resort-style villas, and commercial property corridors stretching directly across my grandfather's ranch land. My land wasn't just valuable, it was the missing piece, and Vivian Crow knew it. Grant uncovered developer meeting records linking Silver Creek board members to future investment payouts tied to expansion approval. Several HOA officials weren't simply volunteers protecting property values. They were financially connected to the development itself. One board member stood to make nearly $2 million through infrastructure contracts if the southern expansion project succeeded. Another secretly owned shares in a construction company already bidding on future projects. And Vivian Crow? She was positioned right in the middle of all of it. "She's not protecting the neighborhood," I said while staring at the documents spread across Grant's desk. Grant nodded calmly. "She's protecting an investment." That explained everything. The fake urgency, the harassment, the coordinated legal pressure. This wasn't personal for Vivian. It was business. And businesses remove obstacles. Grant also found something else buried inside older legal records. The same surveying company Silver Creek Estates hired for my property dispute had previously been investigated in another county over fraudulent boundary adjustments tied to commercial land acquisitions. No convictions, but enough complaints existed to leave a trail. One surveyor involved in my case had even testified during a civil lawsuit years earlier involving manipulated acreage calculations. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my face slowly. This thing goes deeper than I thought. Grant gave a dry laugh. Land corruption usually does. Meanwhile, cracks inside Silver Creek Estates itself had quietly started forming. Residents were beginning to notice how aggressively Vivian pushed the ranch dispute. Some homeowners questioned why HOA funds were suddenly tied up in expensive legal actions over land most residents had never even walked across. And once rumors spread that the original Bennett deed might invalidate the revised surveys, people started getting nervous, especially older residents. That's when the quiet visits began. The first came from an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis. She showed up at the ranch one evening just before sunset, driving a silver sedan with Silver Creek HOA decals still attached to the bumper. I almost didn't trust her at first, but the moment she stepped out of the car, she looked terrified. "I can't stay long," she whispered immediately. I led her onto the porch while she nervously looked back toward the road. Margaret had lived in Silver Creek Estates for nearly 10 years. According to her, Vivian Crow spent years presenting herself as the community's protector, someone fighting to preserve neighborhood standards against irresponsible landowners nearby, including my grandfather. Vivian told everyone Walter Bennett was impossible to work with, Margaret admitted quietly. What exactly did she say? That he blocked emergency road planning, endangered future water access, hurt local property values. I clenched my jaw, listening. Walter Bennett spent his entire life helping people in this county, and Vivian turned him into a villain because he refused to sell his land. Margaret looked guilty even talking about it. Some of us believed her at first. What changed? She hesitated. Because every time your grandfather refused another offer, the pressure increased. That sentence hit me immediately. Pressure. Exactly what Vivian was doing to me now. Margaret explained how HOA meetings slowly shifted over the years. At first, discussions focused on landscaping rules and neighborhood maintenance. Then suddenly everything became about expansion, property access, future development opportunities, the Bennett Ranch. Vivian talked about it constantly, almost obsessively. Before leaving, Margaret handed me a folded stack of printed emails. "I shouldn't have these," she whispered. The moment she drove away, I carried the papers straight inside and started reading, and my blood ran cold. Internal HOA communications. Private exchanges between Vivian Crow, board members, and development representatives. Some messages discussed strategy for acquiring unresolved Bennett acreage. Others outlined plans for increasing county pressure through zoning complaints and environmental reviews. But one email stopped me completely. It had been sent less than a year before my grandfather died. Vivian herself wrote it. "Walter Bennett's health continues declining. Resistance from the property should become significantly easier within the next 12 months. I read that line 3 times. Then again. My hands actually started shaking. Grant read it silently beside me before slowly removing his glasses. "That's bad," he muttered. Bad didn't even begin covering it. Further emails revealed deliberate plans to isolate Walter during his final years, and increased code complaints, easement pressure, water access disputes, and attempts to financially exhaust him through legal filings. They targeted him intentionally, an old man in declining health, and they waited for him to weaken. I walked outside before I punched something. Night wind rolled across the ranch while anger burned through my chest so hard it almost made me sick. All those years I thought my grandfather was simply stubborn. But Walter Bennett wasn't fighting developers because he enjoyed conflict. He was defending this land from people who spent decades trying to wear him down piece by piece, alone. And the worst part? He probably knew nobody would believe him. I looked across the dark pasture toward the old barn silhouetted under moonlight, and suddenly understood why Walter never left this place, even when age started breaking him down. Because he knew the second he stopped fighting, people like Vivian Crow would come for everything. By the time Silver Creek Estates announced an emergency HOA town hall meeting, the entire county already knew something was wrong. Flyers appeared across town calling it a public discussion regarding ongoing ranch safety concerns and future community development. But everybody understood what it really was. Vivian Crow wanted to bury me publicly before the legal situation collapsed around her. Grant warned me before we left for the meeting. "She's going to make this emotional," he said while adjusting his tie inside the truck. "People protect narratives before they protect facts." The meeting took place inside the Silver Creek Community Clubhouse, a massive stone building designed to impress wealthy retirees and investors pretending they lived in a small western town. By the time we arrived, the parking lot was overflowing. Residents, county officials, developers, local business owners, even Sheriff Dalton stood near the entrance looking uncomfortable. The second I walked inside, conversation shifted. Some people stared openly. Others avoided eye contact completely. At the front of the room, Vivian Crow stood beside a projector screen wearing a navy blazer and the kind of controlled smile politicians use before destroying someone publicly. She looked completely prepared. Grant leaned toward me quietly. "Stay calm no matter what happens." Easy for him to say. The meeting started with fake professionalism. One HOA board member rambled through financial updates nobody cared about before finally handing the floor to Vivian. The room quieted instantly. Vivian stepped forward with polished confidence. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Unfortunately, recent events involving the Bennett Ranch property dispute have forced the HOA to address serious concerns affecting community safety and future development stability." There it was. Not property ownership, not legal confusion, safety. She was framing me as a threat already. Vivian clicked a remote and photographs appeared on the projector screen. The broken fencing, cattle near roadways, construction delays, and legal filings. Every image is carefully chosen to make me look reckless. "We've attempted peaceful resolution repeatedly," Vivian continued smoothly. "But Mr. Bennett has unfortunately refused cooperation at every stage." Murmurs spread across the room. Then she shifted toward personal attacks. "Several residents have reported aggressive confrontations." Lie. Contractors expressed concerns about unpredictable behavior on the property. Another lie. And ongoing financial instability surrounding ranch operations raises legitimate concerns about future land maintenance responsibilities. That one hit differently, because she wasn't just attacking me anymore. She was attacking my credibility as a man, like I was some irresponsible failure standing in the way of progress. I saw several residents nodding, exactly what Vivian wanted. Then she delivered the real line. Silver Creek Estate simply wants orderly growth, responsible development, and legal clarification. Grant quietly muttered beside me. She rehearsed every word. Vivian continued speaking for another 10 minutes, carefully painting herself as the calm protector of the community while portraying me as emotional, unstable, and financially desperate. And honestly, a month earlier it probably would have worked. Then she made one mistake. She opened the floor for questions. At first, nobody moved. Then Margaret Ellis slowly stood up from the third row, the same elderly resident who secretly gave me the HOA emails. Her voice shook slightly. Vivian, if this is only about legal clarification, why were internal HOA discussions about removing the Bennett Ranch years before Mr. Bennett passed away? The room instantly changed. Vivian's expression tightened for half a second before recovering. I'm not sure what you mean. Margaret looked terrified but continued anyway. I mean the emails discussing pressure campaigns against Walter Bennett. Now the room exploded into whispers. Several HOA board members immediately looked toward Vivian, not confidently, nervously. Vivian's smile faded slightly. I believe there's confusion regarding private development conversations. No, I said loudly for the first time all night. Every head turned toward me. I stood slowly from my chair while my pulse hammered against my ribs. No more confusion. Grant gave a tiny nod beside me, so I walked forward. For weeks, Vivian Crow controlled the narrative while I stayed defensive, exhausted, isolated, angry. But now I had evidence. I reached the front table and placed several folders down hard enough to echo through the clubhouse. You want to talk about legal clarification? I asked. Vivian crossed her arms carefully. Mr. Bennett, this meeting isn't intended for emotional accusations. I looked directly at her. Good, because facts are easier. That got everyone's attention. I pulled out copies of the revised survey documents first. These property revisions claim sections of my ranch were corrected through historical reassessment. I held up one page. Except the formatting on these documents didn't exist during the years they were supposedly filed. Several people frowned immediately. I continued. One county approval references a surveyor who died before the paperwork was created. More murmuring. Vivian interrupted quickly. Technical clerical errors don't invalidate broader legal surveys. Grant finally stood beside me. Actually, Ms. Crow, they absolutely can. The room quieted again. Grant spoke calmly, like a professor dismantling a student's argument piece by piece. These revised boundary documents contain inconsistent legal formatting, conflicting deed references, and indexing sequences that do not match official county filing structures. One HOA board member suddenly looked pale. Grant continued. And that's before discussing the archive discrepancies. Vivian's eyes narrowed instantly. There it was, the first crack. What archive discrepancies? Someone asked from the audience. Grant reached into his briefcase slowly. Interesting question. Then he placed copies of missing archive logs onto the projector table. These county records were removed from digital indexing systems years ago. The room erupted again. What? Removed by who? That's illegal. Vivian stepped forward sharply. These accusations are outrageous. But for the first time since I met her, she sounded rattled. I watched her carefully while residents started speaking over one another. One older man stood suddenly. You told us the Bennett property surveys were finalized years ago. Another woman shouted. Were HOA funds used for this? Several board members immediately started arguing among themselves. Panic. Actual panic. And Vivian Crow hated losing control. You're being manipulated, she snapped toward the audience. This is exactly why legal matters shouldn't become public spectacles. Then I pulled out the emails. Silence hit the room almost instantly. I didn't even need to say much. I simply read aloud. Walter Bennett's health continues declining. Resistance from the property should become significantly easier within the next 12 months. The clubhouse went dead quiet. You could literally hear people breathing. Margaret Ellis covered her mouth. One board member whispered, "Oh my God." Vivian's face lost color for the first time all night. "That email is being taken out of context," she said quickly. "Really?" I asked. Then I read another. "Additional pressure through zoning enforcement may accelerate negotiations." Then another. "Future development access depends entirely on acquisition of Bennett acreage." The room exploded. People started yelling openly now. "You lied to us! You used HOA money for land deals? This was never about community safety." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, trying unsuccessfully to calm everyone down while board members argued with residents across the room. Vivian turned toward Grant furiously. "You have no authority presenting incomplete legal material publicly." Grant looked almost amused. "Actually, Ms. Crow, we've recently recovered several documents your side probably hoped would stay missing." That stopped her cold. Not visibly for most people, but I saw it. Fear. Real fear. Grant opened another folder carefully. The county archive entries tied to the original Bennett property filings have suddenly reappeared. The room quieted instantly again. Vivian stared at him without speaking. Grant adjusted his glasses slowly. "And based on those recovered filings," he paused deliberately, "we believe we've located the original Bennett ranch deed." Every sound inside the clubhouse disappeared, and for the very first time since this nightmare started, Vivian Crow looked genuinely afraid. The County Land Commission hearing started at 9 sharp, but by 8:30 the courthouse already looked packed enough for a murder trial. News vans lined the street outside. Residents from Silver Creek Estates crowded the courthouse steps, whispering rumors back and forth, while county officials hurried through the entrance, trying not to talk to reporters. And standing near the front doors, like she owned the entire building, was Vivian Crow. Perfect gray suit, sunglasses, calm expression, like none of this worried her at all. Developers and HOA attorneys surrounded her, carrying binders and legal folders thick enough to choke a horse. Every few seconds, somebody leaned toward Vivian quietly while she nodded like a CEO managing employees. Grant Holloway stepped beside me, carrying 2 old document cases under one arm. "You all right?" he asked. "No," I admitted honestly. "Good," Grant muttered. "Means you still understand what this costs if we lose." That didn't help. Inside, the hearing chamber felt tense before proceedings even started. County commissioners sat behind raised desks reviewing paperwork while residents filled nearly every seat in the gallery. I spotted Margaret Ellis near the back row, clutching her purse nervously. Sheriff Dalton stood against the rear wall, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Meanwhile, Vivian looked completely composed. The lead commissioner finally called the hearing to order. "This session concerns disputed property claims involving Silver Creek Estates and the Bennett Ranch." Vivian's lead attorney stood first. Tall, expensive suit, smooth voice. "For decades," he began, "historical survey discrepancies affecting acreage adjacent to Silver Creek Estates remained unresolved." He spoke carefully, framing everything like a technical misunderstanding complicated by my refusal to cooperate. According to him, the HOA simply wanted legal clarification and orderly regional development. Same polished nonsense Vivian had been feeding residents for years. Then he presented the revised surveys. These updated county assessments confirm acreage irregularities requiring correction. Several commissioners nodded while reviewing the documents. Vivian sat quietly beside her attorneys with complete confidence. Until Grant Holloway stood up. The room changed immediately. Grant wasn't flashy. He didn't raise his voice or perform for the crowd. He simply walked forward carrying a stack of files and said, "Before discussing revised surveys, we should establish whether these surveys are legitimate." Silence spread across the room. Grant laid several documents before the commissioners. These filings contain impossible indexing sequences, inconsistent formatting standards, and legal terminology that did not exist during the years they were supposedly created. Vivian's attorney stood instantly. Objection! Speculation! Grant barely glanced at him. It stopped being speculation when we compared them against archived county records. Now the commissioners looked interested. Grant continued methodically dismantling the surveys piece by piece. One filing referenced a surveyor who died years before the document was supposedly approved. Another used county formatting standards introduced nearly a decade later. Several acreage adjustments lacked mandatory state review authorization. Even I could see commissioners becoming uncomfortable. Then Grant called his first witness, Howard Pike, a retired state survey analyst with over 40 years of land dispute experience. Howard looked like somebody's grandfather, but the second he started talking, the room listened. Grant handed him the revised surveys. "Mr. Pike," Grant asked calmly, "do these documents appear authentic?" Howard adjusted his glasses slowly before answering. "No." One word, heavy enough to shift the entire hearing. Howard explained how multiple coordinates physically conflicted with historical county grid systems. Certain property adjustments violated state boundary regulations tied to protected landmarkers near the southern ridge. Then Grant asked the key question. Was state approval filed for those changes? Howard looked directly at the commissioners. There's no evidence approval ever existed. Murmurs spread instantly through the chamber. Vivian finally leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. That was the first time I saw tension crack through her confidence. Grant pressed harder. Next came archive records, missing entries, removed filing references, evidence suggesting official county indexing systems had been altered years earlier. One commissioner frowned deeply while reviewing the material. Are you implying county records were manipulated intentionally? Grant answered carefully. I'm suggesting somebody benefited from their disappearance. That sentence landed like dynamite. Suddenly, this didn't feel like a property disagreement anymore. It felt criminal. Vivian's attorney became aggressive after that. Constant objections, interruptions, requests for procedural delays. At one point, he accused Grant of creating conspiracy theories. Grant calmly replied, "No theory is necessary when the paperwork contradicts itself." Even some Silver Creek residents sitting behind Vivian started looking nervous, especially once Grant introduced internal HOA communications discussing future development expansion across Bennett Ranch property. One commissioner looked sharply toward Vivian. These emails reference planned infrastructure routes through disputed acreage. Vivian stood immediately. This presentation is misleading, she snapped. For the first time since I met her, her composure slipped. Grant stayed perfectly calm. Is the HOA financially connected to future development projects, Ms. Crow? Vivian hesitated slightly. Wrong move. Several residents noticed. This hearing concerns property clarification, she answered carefully. Grant nodded once. Of course. Then he opened one of the old document cases he brought into court. The room instantly quieted. Inside rested a weathered leather folder tied with faded straps. Even from across the room, I recognized my grandfather's handwriting. My chest tightened immediately. Grant carefully unfolded a thick yellow document onto the evidence table. This, he said quietly, is the original Bennett Ranch deed. Complete silence filled the chamber. The document looked ancient compared to Silver Creek's polished filings. Old state registration seals covered the corners alongside handwritten survey notes and boundary references dating back decades before Silver Creek Estates even existed. Grant pointed carefully across the pages. Original survey coordinates. Then another section. Protected historical boundary markers. Then finally the signatures. Legally binding registrations filed long before HOA incorporation. Vivian's attorney stood up so fast his chair slammed backward into the floor, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I watched genuine panic spread across Vivian Crow's face. The second Grant revealed the original Bennett Ranch deed, the entire hearing room changed. Not emotionally, legally. Vivian's attorney rushed toward the evidence table immediately. We request authentication review before this document is considered admissible. Grant nodded calmly. Already completed. That answer hit like a hammer. Grant handed certified archive verification papers directly to the commissioners along with state preservation records tied to the original deed. The lead commissioner adjusted his glasses while reviewing the material. These filings predate Silver Creek Estates by nearly 30 years. Correct, Grant said. He then pointed toward several handwritten survey references embedded inside the deed itself. Protected historical boundary markers recognized under state agricultural preservation statutes. One commissioner frowned. Meaning? Grant looked directly at the panel. Meaning those boundaries cannot legally be altered without state-level authorization. Silence. Then another commissioner flipped through Silver Creek's revised surveys. There's no state authorization attached here. Because it never existed, Grant replied. That's when Vivian finally stood up. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Silver Creek relied on approved county survey corrections. Grant turned toward her slowly. Approved by who? Vivian froze for half a second, just enough. Her attorney immediately stepped in. The HOA acted in good faith using available county records. Grant nodded once. The problem is those county records were manipulated. The room exploded into whispers again. One commissioner leaned forward sharply. Are you formally alleging fraud? Grant didn't hesitate. Yes. That word hit the chamber like a gunshot. Fraud. Not confusion, not clerical mistakes. Fraud. Vivian's attorney immediately objected, but now even the commissioners looked disturbed. One of them quietly asked county staff to retrieve additional archive records, while another began comparing dates between the original deed and Silver Creek's revised filings. The inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Different acreage totals, altered coordinates, missing transfer approvals. One commissioner actually muttered, "My God." Then Grant delivered the final blow. He called a digital record specialist from the State Archive Department who testified remotely through video conference. The specialist explained how county indexing systems showed evidence of historical alteration activity tied specifically to Bennett property records. Not accidental corruption, targeted modifications. Several filing references connected to the ranch had been manually removed years earlier during digital conversion updates. Grant asked the obvious question. In your professional opinion, were these records intentionally altered? The specialist answered calmly, yes. That single word shattered whatever credibility Silver Creek Estates still had left. Residents inside the gallery started arguing openly. You told us everything was legal. This was all planned? You used HOA money for this? Vivian looked furious now, but underneath the anger I could finally see it. Fear. Real fear. Her attorney whispered frantically beside her while developers near the back of the room started quietly gathering their papers like they suddenly wanted distance from the situation. Then one commissioner asked the question nobody in Silver Creek wanted answered. Ms. Crow, were HOA board members financially connected to future expansion projects involving disputed ranch property? Vivian tried recovering her composure. Silver Creek Estates explored development opportunities benefiting the broader community. That's not what he asked, another commissioner interrupted sharply. Grant slid several financial disclosure records forward. Investment contracts, development agreements, projected infrastructure payouts, all tied directly to future expansion across Bennett Ranch land. One board member sitting behind Vivian suddenly stood up. I didn't know about most of this. Another followed, then another. Panic spread across the HOA side of the room like wildfire. People started turning on each other publicly. One elderly resident pointed directly at Vivian. You told us Walter Bennett refused reasonable cooperation. Grant calmly lifted another document. Actually, Walter Bennett repeatedly challenged survey inconsistencies tied to these same expansion plans years ago. I felt something tighten in my chest hearing that, because suddenly I understood the full truth. My grandfather wasn't paranoid. He wasn't stubborn for no reason. He saw this coming years before anyone else did, and he spent the final years of his life trying to stop it alone. The lead commissioner finally raised his voice over the chaos. Enough! The room quieted slowly. He looked directly toward Vivian Crow. Based on the evidence presented today, this commission is immediately suspending all disputed acreage claims pending full state investigation. Vivian's face went pale. The commissioner continued. All HOA enforcement actions against the Bennett property are hereby frozen. Another commissioner added, We are also referring archive discrepancies and survey irregularities for criminal review. That was it. Silver Creek collapsed right there in real time. Developers quietly exited the room first. Then board members started distancing themselves from Vivian openly. One even whispered, "She handled all the filings herself." Vivian looked around the chamber like she genuinely couldn't believe control was slipping away. For weeks, she acted untouchable. Now nobody wanted to stand beside her, not even her own people. Grant slowly packed the original deed back into its leather case while reporters rushed toward the exits to file breaking news stories. Fraud investigations, manipulated surveys, corrupt HOA land seizure attempts. Everything Vivian built was burning down publicly. And through all the noise, all the arguments, all the cameras flashing around the room, I kept staring at my grandfather's signature on that original deed. Walter Bennett knew. He knew they'd eventually come for the ranch. That's why he protected those boundary markers decades earlier. That's why he documented everything. That's why he never sold. Not because he feared change, because he understood exactly what kind of people were waiting behind it. As Grant closed the leather case beside me, he looked over quietly. "Your grandfather saved this ranch long before either of us walked into this courtroom." I looked around the collapsing hearing chamber one last time before answering. "No," I said softly. "He saved it because he knew someday somebody would finally listen." 3 weeks after the hearing, Silver Creek Estates looked nothing like the untouchable empire Vivian Crow once controlled. The neighborhood gates still stood. The expensive houses were still there. But the illusion of power was gone. State investigators arrived 2 days after the Land Commission ruling. County offices got flooded with subpoenas, financial audits, and archive reviews tied to manipulated survey records. Rumors spread fast through Blackwater County. Fraud investigations, illegal land filings, developer kickbacks. By the end of the week, 3 HOA board members resigned publicly. Vivian Crow disappeared completely. Nobody saw her at HOA meetings anymore. Her attorneys stopped making statements. Even the developers who once followed her around like loyal soldiers suddenly acted like they barely knew her name. That's how people like Vivian survive. When power collapses, everybody runs. Grant Holloway called me one morning while I was repairing fencing near the southern pasture. "They officially dismissed all acreage claims," he said. I leaned against the fence post quietly. Just hearing the words felt strange. After months of fighting, stress, sleepless nights, and constant pressure, it was over. "The ranch is fully protected under the original deed," Grant continued. "No further challenges can move forward without state review." I looked across the open fields while wind rolled through the grass. My grandfather won. That realization hit me harder than the actual legal victory. Not me, Walter Bennett. Because the truth was, I almost lost this ranch within weeks of inheriting it. He was the one who prepared for the fight decades earlier. He saw the danger long before anyone else did. And somehow, even after death, he still protected the land. That afternoon, I started replacing the old Bennett property marker that somebody tried burning weeks earlier. The original post had black scorch marks running halfway down the wood. Part of me wanted to leave it damaged as a reminder, but another part understood exactly what my grandfather would have done. Repair it. Keep moving. So I dug a fresh foundation near the fence line and mounted a new carved cedar marker beside the old one. Bennett Ranch, EST, 1941. Simple, solid, permanent. As I worked, trucks occasionally slowed near the road. Some drivers waved awkwardly before continuing on. A month earlier, half this county looked at me like I was unstable. Now people suddenly acted respectful again. Funny how truth changes things. Around sunset, Margaret Ellis stopped by the ranch carrying a homemade pie wrapped in foil. "I figured you probably haven't eaten properly in weeks," she said nervously. I laughed for the first time in days. She stood beside the fence quietly for a moment before speaking again. "A lot of us should have questioned Vivian sooner." I shrugged. "She was good at making people afraid." Margaret nodded sadly. "She made everyone believe development was inevitable." That word again. I looked across the ranch toward the creek reflecting orange sunset light. Maybe that was the real problem with people like Vivian Crow. They convince communities that history matters less than profit, that old things should move aside for expensive new ones, that land only matters once somebody wealthy wants it. But standing there beside my family's ranch, I realized something important. Some places carry too much history to become investment property. Over the next few weeks, the pressure finally disappeared. No more drones, no more violation notices, no more anonymous harassment online. The ranch slowly became quiet again, real quiet, the kind I hadn't felt since childhood. I repaired damaged fencing, restored the broken barn locks, and finally got the security cameras running properly again. Local contractors who avoided me earlier suddenly returned phone calls pretending nothing happened. One even offered discounted repairs. I declined. Sheriff Dalton showed up unexpectedly one afternoon while I was checking water lines near the north field. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed heavily. I should have stepped in earlier. I kept working. Dalton looked older than he did a month ago. People around here got too comfortable letting Vivian Crow control things, he admitted quietly. You included? He didn't answer right away. Finally, yeah. At least he was honest. Before leaving, Dalton glanced across the ranch and shook his head slowly. Your grandfather would have been proud you stayed. That sentence stayed with me long after he drove away, because the truth was, there were nights I almost walked away from all of it. Vivian Crow nearly broke me, financially, emotionally, mentally. And honestly, maybe that was always the strategy. Make the fight painful enough until surrender feels easier than resistance. But Walter Bennett understood something I didn't until the very end. If you surrender land tied to your family's history, you never really get it back. A few days later, I climbed the western ridge just before sunrise, the same place where my grandfather once stood watching developers build the first Silver Creek roads years ago. The ranch stretched endlessly beneath the morning light. Open fields, old barns, creek water cutting through the pastures. Home. I stood there alone, listening to wind move through the grass while memories of Walter Bennett drifted through my head. The way he walked the fence lines every morning, the way he documented everything, the way he refused to bend no matter how much pressure people applied. For years I thought stubbornness defined him. Now I understood better. It wasn't stubbornness, it was protection. And for the first time since inheriting the ranch, the land finally felt safe again. A month after the hearing, Silver Creek Estate stopped talking about expansion completely. The luxury development signs near the subdivision entrance quietly disappeared one by one. Construction equipment vanished from the southern ridge. Even the county stopped pretending the Bennett Ranch dispute was some simple paperwork issue. Everybody knew what really happened now. Vivian Crow never came back to Blackwater County publicly after the investigation started. Rumors spread that state fraud investigators were still reviewing financial records connected to the HOA and several developers tied to the project. Honestly, I stopped caring. Because for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I finally understood something my grandfather spent years trying to teach me. Land isn't just dirt, it's memory. Every fence line on that ranch carried pieces of my family. Every barn beam, creek crossing, and pasture held stories older than Silver Creek Estates ever was. People like Vivian Crow only saw acreage numbers and future profits. But Walter Bennett saw legacy. That's why he fought so hard. And now I understood why he never backed down. One evening, just before sunset, I rode out toward the western ridge where my grandfather used to stand watching over the property. The sky burned orange across the fields while wind moved slowly through the grass. Everything looked peaceful again. No bulldozers, no survey stakes, no threats taped to my front door. Just open land stretching farther than the eye could see. I climbed down near the old boundary marker we rebuilt together in his memory and rested my hand against the wood for a second. Then I looked across the ranch and smiled quietly to myself. Vivian Crow thought paperwork could erase 80 years of family history. She thought pressure could make people surrender what mattered most. But my grandfather already knew something she didn't. Some land remembers exactly who it belongs to, and no amount of money can change that. If you've ever dealt with corrupt HOAs, land disputes, or people trying to bully families out of what's theirs, let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, Make sure to subscribe for more real-world property battles, legal revenge stories, and small-town conflicts where powerful people finally get exposed. Because sometimes the only thing stronger than greed is somebody refusing to give up their home.